February 15th, 1941. In the dead of night, 3 Polish men descended by parachute into Nazi-occupied Poland. Their landing went unnoticed by most, but it marked the birth of something extraordinary. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were the first of a secret force that would strike terror into the occupiers, haunting them in silence and shadows. How do you fight an empire when your country has already been enslaved? How do you resist when the enemy controls your streets, your homes, and even your future? For Poland, the answer came in the form of courage hidden behind ordinary faces, and missions so daring they sounded like legend. They would be known as the Silent Unseen. The very name carried an air of mystery, a force invisible to the world, yet devastating to the enemy. Their story was one of sacrifice, betrayal, and unyielding defiance. And it began on that cold February night. The origins of the Silent Unseen began not on the battlefield, but in the restless mind of a Polish officer named Captain Jan Gorski. It was 1939, and Poland had just been crushed between 2 brutal powers, Nazi Germany from the west and Soviet Russia from the east. For many, the war seemed lost. But Gorski refused to believe that Poland's fight was over. Instead, he asked himself a dangerous question. If soldiers could no longer defend their homeland openly, could they strike the enemy from within? He proposed the creation of small, specially trained units of Poles who would parachute back into their occupied country. Their mission would be sabotage, intelligence, and resistance. To Gorski, it was the only logical way forward. But at the time, his vision seemed far too radical. Military leaders dismissed it as unrealistic, even reckless. Who could imagine ordinary men leaping from planes into enemy territory and surviving long enough to make a difference? The idea might have died there, but history forced it to evolve. After Poland's defeat, tens of thousands of soldiers escaped to Britain. It was here, in exile, that Gorski found a new audience. The British themselves were experimenting with unconventional warfare, forming units that operated in secrecy behind enemy lines. Gorski's plan no longer seemed impossible. It now looked essential. In those early months of exile, with London under bombardment and Europe under Nazi control, the Polish officers who gathered around Gorski began shaping a new force. It would be small, it would be secret, and it would demand the highest level of sacrifice. What seemed like a dream in 1939 was becoming a blueprint for Poland's silent army. The dream of a secret Polish force finally began to take shape in exile. After months of persuasion, British authorities agreed to let the Polish army in the West form a small elite unit of men who would be dropped into their occupied homeland. Recruitment had to be done quietly, for not every soldier was meant for this path. Those chosen were told almost nothing at first. They simply vanished from their regular units, leaving behind comrades who never knew where they had gone. It was this quiet disappearance that gave them their haunting name, the Silent Unseen. From the beginning, secrecy was everything. Volunteers could not write home about where they were going or why. Even among themselves, details were limited. What they knew was this: they were training for missions so dangerous that survival was never guaranteed. And yet, hundreds volunteered, willing to risk everything for the chance to strike back at the occupiers. Training camps were set up in the remote Scottish countryside, far from prying eyes. Later, some courses were held in Italy, where the terrain provided new challenges. The regimen was relentless. Candidates were pushed to the very edge of physical and mental endurance. Long marches through freezing landscapes tested stamina. Psychological endurance tests measured whether a man could keep calm under unbearable pressure. Every flaw was exposed, because in enemy territory, the smallest mistake could mean death. The skills taught were as diverse as they were ruthless. They learned how to jump from planes at night, landing silently with only the moon to guide them. They mastered forgery, producing false documents convincing enough to fool German officials. Sabotage became an art, blowing up rail lines, disrupting communications, and making the enemy feel unsafe in their own strongholds. They studied radio operation, lockpicking, and the deadly use of small arms. Nothing was left to chance. But the training was not only about techniques, it was about breaking down ordinary men and remaking them as shadows. Each candidate had to prove he could vanish into a crowd, assume a new identity, and disappear without leaving a trace. The motto was simple but merciless: succeed in silence or never return. Behind the discipline, there was a deeply human story. Many of these recruits had already lost families in the war. Some were barely more than boys, desperate for revenge. Others were seasoned officers who carried the heavy burden of exile. At night, around campfires, they spoke in low voices about Poland, about mothers they might never see again, about friends executed by the occupiers. Each man knew he might soon share the same fate, yet still, they prepared. The process was brutal, and not all survived it. Some were dismissed for lack of readiness, others broke under the strain. Those who remained were no longer just soldiers, they were ghosts in waiting. By the time training was complete, the silent unseen had been forged into a weapon unlike any Poland had ever known. They were ready to return to their homeland, not as an army of thousands, but as scattered sparks of resistance, each one capable of igniting chaos in the enemy's heart. The true test came in 1941, when the silent unseen undertook their very first mission. On that night, Captain Józef Zabielski became the first Polish officer to parachute into occupied territory. Alongside him came weapons, supplies, and orders that carried the weight of a nation's hope. It was more than a daring jump. It was proof that even under occupation, Poland's fight was far from finished. This first landing opened the door to what became known as the air bridge. Across the skies of Europe, a secret lifeline was established between exiled command in Britain and the underground resistance at home. Planes flew in darkness, slipping past German defenses to drop not just men, but the tools of rebellion. Crates of weapons, radio transmitters, forged documents, and stacks of money were parachuted into fields and forests. Each delivery meant survival for the underground state. Each drop was a promise that Poland had not been abandoned. Yet the scale of the operation made it one of the most dangerous undertakings of the war. The flights originated from distant airfields in Britain, later extended to bases in Italy, and each mission meant hours of flying over hostile territory. German radar and night fighters patrolled the skies, and anti-aircraft guns lined the coasts. Crews knew that one wrong move, one engine failure, or even a flash of light could seal their fate. Losses were heavy. Many planes never returned, swallowed by the darkness or consumed in flames over enemy territory. Dozens of pilots and airmen gave their lives just to deliver a handful of agents or a few crates of supplies. Every success carried a shadow of tragedy, and every safe landing was bought at the highest possible price. Still, the missions continued. Between 1941 and 1944, the air bridge delivered hundreds of silent, unseen agents into occupied Poland and thousands of containers filled with desperately needed supplies. The flow of weapons and information gave the resistance teeth, turning scattered groups into a coordinated force capable of striking back. These early missions set the tone for what the silent unseen would become, a force that thrived on impossible odds, where every drop carried the risk of death, yet every landing meant life for a resistance that refused to die. The air bridge was more than an operation. It was a lifeline across the skies, binding the exiled army to its enslaved homeland and showing the world that Poland's war was still burning in the shadows. Once the silent unseen touched down in Poland, their real battle began. They were absorbed into the home army, the underground military organization that carried the burden of national resistance. From that moment on, every hour was a test of survival. They were soldiers without uniforms, fighting a war where one wrong glance or one suspicious word could mean death. Their tasks were as vital as they were deadly. Intelligence gathering was the backbone of their mission. Reports on troop movements, railway schedules, and military installations were smuggled back to London through hidden radio stations. These messages, typed on flimsy sheets and transmitted in code, often decided the timing of Allied operations. At the same time, sabotage became a daily weapon. Bridges collapsed under explosives planted in darkness. Railway lines were torn apart, derailing supply trains bound for the Eastern Front. Even small acts, cutting phone lines, disabling vehicles, were blows that disrupted the enemy's confidence. Forgery was another lifeline. In a world where identity papers meant survival, the silent unseen became masters of creating false documents. A forged stamp or a counterfeit pass could buy freedom for a fellow fighter, or allow an agent to slip through German checkpoints unnoticed. But with each forged page came a gamble. If the deception was uncovered, the punishment was torture, followed by execution. Living in Warsaw or other occupied cities meant existing under unbearable pressure. The Gestapo's presence was everywhere. Black cars prowling the streets, raids launched without warning, neighbors disappearing overnight. Agents carried multiple identities, changing names and addresses as often as others changed clothes. They slept in safe houses that could be betrayed at any moment. Even a casual meeting in a cafe or a whispered conversation on a tram carried the risk of exposure. The threat of capture was constant, and everyone knew what it meant. The Gestapo's methods were designed to break not just bodies, but spirits. Torture chambers echoed with screams, and few who entered ever walked out alive. The silent unseen accepted this fate as part of their oath. Silence under interrogation was not only expected but sacred. Betrayal of comrades was the greatest dishonor. Many carried cyanide pills sewn into their clothing, a final act of control should they fall into enemy hands. Yet in spite of the terror, their resolve hardened. Every successful mission, every shipment of intelligence, every sabotage that rattled the enemy was proof that Poland had not been silenced. They lived among the people, unseen but vital, their courage breathing life into a nation struggling to endure. For the silent unseen, daily existence was a balance between ordinary gestures and extraordinary risks. Buying bread, riding a tram, or attending mass could all be masks for clandestine work. It was life in shadows, where death was always near, but where the hope of freedom gave every risk meaning. Every resistance movement has its legends, but for the silent unseen, those legends walked among them as flesh and blood. Each of them carried stories of impossible bravery, unshakable loyalty, and often devastating sacrifice. Leopold Okulicki was one such figure. Rising through the ranks, he became the last commander of the Home Army, the underground force that kept Poland's spirit alive during occupation. His leadership was marked by determination in the face of hopeless odds. When others saw only collapse, Okulicki fought to preserve unity and purpose, but his fate was cruel. After the war, he fell into Soviet hands, imprisoned, and died under suspicious circumstances. For many, he became a symbol not just of resistance against one enemy, but betrayal at the hands of another. Then there was Krystyna Skarbek, perhaps the most famous of them all. Known for her charm and daring, she operated across Europe, feeding intelligence that saved countless lives. She was so effective that both the Gestapo and the British feared her unpredictability. Nicknamed Churchill's favorite spy, Skarbek embodied audacity. Yet her end came quietly. Stabbed in London years after the war, her sacrifices nearly forgotten by the world she had served. Adolf Pilch commanded a partisan force of nearly 1,000 fighters. With limited weapons and endless dangers, he led daring strikes against German units, proving that even a small force could rattle an empire. His name spread like a whisper through occupied villages, a reminder that courage could still command fear. Pilch survived the war, but lived with the memory of fallen comrades, carrying the weight of leadership long after the fighting stopped. And then there was Elżbieta Zawaka, the only woman among the silent unseen. Her story defied every stereotype of the time. Acting as a courier, she crossed dangerous borders, carrying vital messages and coordinating missions. Captured and imprisoned, she endured interrogations and torture, yet never broke. Zawaka not only survived but went on to become a general, her life a rare victory in a tale dominated by tragedy. These individuals were more than operatives. They were ordinary people transformed by extraordinary times. They laughed, feared, and loved like anyone else, yet they chose paths that demanded everything. Their fates remind us that history is not just written by armies or governments, but by individuals who decided that silence in the face of tyranny was not an option. The silent unseen lived in shadows, but their legacies shine brightly, carried in the stories of men and women who risked everything for Poland's freedom. By 1944, the silent unseen had already carried out years of dangerous missions, but everything they had trained for led to Operation Tempest, the great nationwide effort to rise against the occupiers. In Warsaw, the Home Army prepared for its boldest gamble, the Warsaw Uprising. The silent unseen were at the heart of it. They served as commanders, couriers, saboteurs, and liaisons. They carried weapons into the city, cut communications, and spread chaos among German troops. For 63 days, they fought in a ruined city, refusing to yield even as supplies ran dry and the streets filled with rubble and blood. Their courage was beyond doubt, but courage could not defeat overwhelming firepower. When the uprising collapsed, thousands lay dead. Among the fallen were many silent unseen, cut down not in distant shadows, but in the very heart of their homeland. Yet their nightmare did not end with surrender. For those who survived, another betrayal awaited. The Soviets, who had watched the uprising collapse without lifting a hand, soon took control of Poland. Instead of honoring the silent unseen, they treated them as enemies. Arrests, show trials, and executions followed. Men and women who had risked everything against the Nazis now faced torture and death at the hands of their supposed liberators. It was a cruel irony. They had parachuted into their country to fight for freedom, but in the end, many were silenced by the new regime. The betrayal was not only political, but deeply personal. Families who had already mourned their sacrifices now suffered again, this time in silence, afraid to even speak their names. The Warsaw Uprising marked both their greatest act of defiance and the beginning of their darkest chapter. Their bravery lit up a city under siege, but their fate showed that even heroes could be abandoned, erased, and condemned. The war ended, but the story of the silent unseen did not fade into silence. Those who survived carried their memories like scars, and in time, many set them down in writing. Memoirs and post-war accounts became fragments of truth in a landscape scarred by censorship and fear. Through these testimonies, the world glimpsed not only the missions, but the human cost behind them, the friendships, the betrayals, the small acts of courage that shaped their journey. Decades later, their legacy found a new life in Poland's modern military. In 1995, the country's elite special forces, known as GROM, adopted the traditions of the silent unseen. This was more than symbolism. It was a direct line connecting the parachutists of the Second World War with a new generation of soldiers, bound by the same spirit of sacrifice and determination. Their stories also reached wider audiences through films, television dramas, and public memorials. Streets and monuments were named in their honor. Each retelling became a reminder that these men and women had lived, fought, and died for freedom, even when history turned against them. And still, a sense of mystery lingers. Why were they called the silent unseen? Some say it was because their work was hidden, their impact invisible to most. Others believe it reflects the fate of many who never returned, whose names remained unspoken for years. Whatever the answer, the title itself carries the weight of reverence. It ensures that, though unseen in life, they will never be forgotten in memory. The silent unseen lived in the shadows, moving quietly, taking on missions that carried almost certain death. Their silence was not only their weapon, but also their burden. They could not speak of their work, could not reveal their identities, and in many cases, could not even say goodbye to the families they left behind. They were ghosts before their time, unseen in life, destined to be remembered only if history chose not to forget them. And yet, their legacy speaks louder than the silence they carried. It echoes in the courage of those who parachuted into darkness with nothing but faith in their cause. It whispers through the stories of resistance, sabotage, and survival passed from one generation to the next. It lives in the pride of a nation that eventually found the strength to honor them, even after decades of betrayal and suppression. The silent unseen remind us that true heroism often wears no uniform of glory. They were ordinary men and women, teachers, students, workers, who chose the impossible because their homeland called. Each mission carried the weight of finality. A failed drop meant capture. A single mistake meant execution. And yet they went again and again, not because they believed survival was likely, but because freedom demanded it. What does it mean to sacrifice everything for a cause? To live without recognition, without applause, and to die knowing that even your name might be erased from memory. The silent unseen faced these questions not in theory, but in reality. Their choices leave us humbled. Their silence leaves us haunted. History has a way of reshaping stories, turning individuals into symbols. But beneath the symbol of the silent unseen lies something deeply human: fear, courage, and the quiet hope that their actions would make a difference. They were not superhuman. They were people who dared to step into the night sky, uncertain if they would ever feel the earth of their homeland again. Today, as we reflect on their journey, we are left with a question that cuts to the heart of our own humanity. If you had the chance to fight for your homeland, knowing you may never return, would you have stepped into the night sky as one of the silent unseen? Their answer was yes, and because of that, their silence has become a voice that will never fade.